There's a structure beneath modern economies that often goes unnoticed, yet it supports nearly everything. It's not gold, it's not technology, it's not even money itself. It's the assumption that borrowing does not usually come to a clear end, that debt once created is managed, refinanced, and carried forward over time. This wasn't always true. For much of human history, debt was temporary by necessity. Kings borrowed for wars, then worked to repay before creditors lost patience. Merchants took loans for voyages, then settled accounts when ships returned. Borrowing was episodic and closely tied to specific events. Over the past several centuries, a quiet shift took place. Debt moved from exception to expectation, not through sudden upheaval, but through gradual acceptance. The question is when this changed, but how small, reasonable decisions across generations built a foundation that now feels remarkably enduring. Before the 17th century, borrowing existed, but it lived at the margins of statecraft. Kings borrowed from merchant families when wars demanded immediate funding. Italian city-states issued bonds to wealthy citizens. The Catholic Church debated whether charging interest was sin or necessity, but these were exceptions, not the rule. Most governance operated on direct revenue, taxes collected, land rents extracted, treasure seized. The worldview was simple: a ruler who borrowed too much was weak. A state perpetually in debt lacked virtue. Solvency meant strength. The ideal was fiscal independence, collecting enough to spend what was needed, then stopping. By the 17th and 18th centuries, this began to change. Europe was growing more complex, trade routes lengthened, wars escalated in scale and cost. Infrastructure projects, roads, canals, ports required capital before they generated returns. Populations expanded, and with them the machinery of administration. In this environment, borrowing started to feel reasonable. Not reckless, but prudent. Why raise taxes immediately and provoke unrest when lenders would advance funds now to be repaid later from future revenue? Why halt a profitable war or abandon a strategic fort when credit could bridge the gap? Debt became a way to smooth the jagged edges of governance, to act decisively without waiting for slower fiscal processes to catch up. The shift was subtle. No king announced a new economic philosophy. No parliament debated debt as ideology. Instead, officials borrowed a little more each year. Lenders grew comfortable. Institutions adapted. What began as practical accommodation began to look permanent. This was not irresponsibility, it was logical. Debt allowed states to move faster than taxation alone permitted. And in a world where rivals also borrowed, choosing not to borrow meant choosing to fall behind. The Dutch Republic offers the first clear example of borrowing becoming systematic rather than sporadic. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the provinces of the Netherlands were fighting for independence from Spain. War was expensive. Taxes alone could not cover costs without crippling commerce. So the Dutch government began issuing bonds, annuities that promised regular payments to investors, funded by customs duties and excise taxes. These were not emergency loans to be quickly repaid. They were structured instruments sold to wealthy merchants, guilds, and foreign investors. The bonds circulated. They could be traded, inherited, pledged as collateral. A secondary market emerged. Debt stopped being a chain linking debtor to creditor and became an asset class, something people sought to own. The innovation was not in borrowing itself, but in making debt indefinite. The Dutch state never planned to fully repay the principal. Instead, it paid interest indefinitely. This transformed the relationship. Debt was no longer failure deferred, it was infrastructure, a permanent claim on future revenue accepted by all parties as normal. England learned from this model. After the Glorious Revolution of 1688, Parliament gained control over royal finances. Wars with France loomed, and funding them required more than traditional taxation could provide. In 1694, the government chartered the Bank of England, which immediately lent the state £2 million in exchange for the right to issue banknotes. This was not a private loan behind closed doors. It was a public institution designed to manage sovereign debt. The bank issued bonds. Investors bought them. The government paid interest from tax revenue. When old bonds matured, new bonds were issued to cover them. The debt rolled forward year after year. What made this arrangement stable was trust. Investors believed Parliament would honor obligations because Parliament itself authorized the borrowing. Unlike monarchs who could default on a whim, a parliamentary system bound future governments to past commitments. Debt became depersonalized, no longer the promise of a king but the guarantee of an institution. This mattered. Suddenly, England could borrow at lower interest rates than absolute monarchies. Creditworthiness became a competitive advantage. France, despite greater wealth and population, paid higher rates because lenders doubted the crown's commitment to repayment. England's debt capacity allowed it to fight longer, spend more, and ultimately prevail in global conflicts. By the 19th century, sovereign debt markets had matured across Europe. Governments issued bonds in London, Amsterdam, Paris. Investors diversified portfolios across nations. Debt was no longer unusual, it was routine. States financed railways, colonial ventures, and industrial expansion through borrowing. The logic was clear: growth required capital now, and debt made capital available. The 20th century deepened this pattern. World War I shattered the fiction that debt was temporary. Governments borrowed unprecedented sums, not millions but billions. Victory mattered more than fiscal balance. When peace came, the debt remained. Repayment was slow, incomplete, or abandoned. Instead, nations refinanced, issued new bonds, and carried the debt forward. The interwar period saw debt crises and defaults, but the underlying structure persisted. After World War II, the Bretton Woods institutions, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, were designed explicitly around sovereign debt. Development required borrowing. Recovery required credit. Debt became the language of international cooperation. This was not a conspiracy. It was not even a deliberate plan. It was the accumulated result of thousands of individual decisions, each one reasonable in its moment, each one solving an immediate problem. A parliament voting to fund a war. A treasury issuing bonds rather than raising taxes. A central bank refinancing obligations. A lender accepting long-term bonds as safe assets. Piece by piece, debt transformed from tool to architecture. No single actor designed the system. It emerged from incentives, institutions, and inertia. Borrowing worked, so it continued. Investors profited, so they participated. Governments gained flexibility, so they borrowed more. What began as necessity quietly became normal. The unintended consequence was this: perpetual debt became stable, not despite its permanence, but because of it. Once everyone, governments, investors, institutions, accepted that debt would never fully disappear, the system stopped being fragile. Expectations adjusted. Markets priced accordingly. Debt was no longer a countdown to default, but a renewable resource perpetually refinanced. This was the silent revolution. Not the invention of borrowing, but the normalization of indefinite obligation. The shift from "we must repay this" to "we will manage this indefinitely." From episodic tool to permanent foundation. Certain patterns appear repeatedly across these centuries. One is the preference for borrowing over immediate taxation. Raising taxes is visible, unpopular, and politically costly. Borrowing is quiet, deferred, and spreads the burden across time. Leaders consistently chose the latter when both options existed. This was not cowardice, it was rational. A government that raised taxes aggressively risked rebellion, capital flight, or electoral defeat. A government that borrowed faced none of these immediate risks. The cost came later, dispersed among future administrations and future taxpayers. The incentive structure favored debt. Another pattern is the role of institutions in enabling debt expansion. The more sophisticated financial systems became, the easier borrowing grew. The creation of central banks, bond markets, credit rating systems, and international lending organizations all increased debt capacity. Each innovation made borrowing cheaper, safer, and more accessible. Complexity encouraged borrowing. Simple economies relied on direct revenue, land taxes, trade duties, tribute. Complex economies required infrastructure, standing militaries, bureaucracies, and welfare systems. These demanded upfront capital. Debt provided it. As societies scaled, debt scaled with them. A third pattern is the stabilization of perpetual debt through institutional trust. Early modern monarchs often defaulted. Lenders demanded high interest rates to compensate for risk. But once borrowing became depersonalized, once it was the state, not the king, that borrowed, default rates fell. Institutions outlasted individuals. Bonds became safer, borrowing became cheaper. A reinforcing cycle emerged. This is often where the transition from occasional to structural debt becomes visible. When default risk declines, borrowing capacity expands. When borrowing capacity expands, debt becomes normal. When debt becomes normal, institutions adapt to manage it. Once institutions adapt, reversing the trend becomes difficult. The pattern is not unique to sovereign debt. Similar dynamics appear in corporate finance, household borrowing, and municipal bonds. Anywhere that institutions mediate between borrowers and lenders, and anywhere that obligations can be rolled forward indefinitely, debt tends to grow. Not because individuals are reckless, but because the system makes borrowing logical. What's striking is how rarely this trajectory reverses. Occasionally, a nation pays down debt after a crisis or windfall, but the baseline rarely returns to zero. Instead, it ratchets upward, stabilizing at a new, higher level. Debt becomes a feature, not a bug. This reflects underlying incentives. Once debt is embedded in fiscal planning, removing it requires either austerity or windfall revenue. Austerity is politically painful. Windfalls are rare, so debt persists. And as it persists, institutions evolve to accommodate it. Budgets assume refinancing. Markets expect issuance. Debt becomes load-bearing. The human element remains constant. At every stage, decision-makers faced pressures, wars, crises, ambitions, constituencies. Borrowing solved immediate problems. The long-term consequences were abstract, distant, uncertain, so they borrowed. The pattern repeated across centuries and continents because the incentives were similar. This is not a moral judgment, it is an observation. Debt expanded because it worked. It solved coordination problems. It allowed societies to act collectively across time, pooling future resources to address present needs. The cost was an obligation, the benefit was capacity. Whether that trade-off was wise depends on perspective, but the pattern is clear. As societies grew more complex, they borrowed more. As they borrowed more, debt became structural. As debt became structural, reversing it became harder. The system reinforced itself. Centuries later, similar patterns reemerged in different contexts. The post-World War II era saw sovereign debt rise sharply, stabilize, then rise again during fiscal crises. Each time, the response followed familiar logic: issue bonds, refinance obligations, defer costs. The expansion of consumer credit in the mid-20th century mirrored earlier sovereign borrowing. Mortgages, credit cards, student loans all allowed individuals to borrow against future income. The same institutional mechanisms appeared: securitization, secondary markets, perpetual refinancing. Debt became foundational to personal finance just as it had for public finance. International development programs institutionalized debt as a tool for growth. Nations borrowed to build infrastructure with the expectation that growth would generate revenue to service obligations. Sometimes it did, often it didn't. Debt persisted regardless, managed through restructuring and new lending. These parallels are not evidence of conspiracy or inevitability. They reflect recurring human responses to similar incentives. When borrowing is possible, when lenders are willing, when immediate needs outweigh distant costs, debt expands. The pattern transcends ideology. Socialist states borrowed. Capitalist states borrowed. Democracies and autocracies alike found debt useful. What remains constant is the institutional response. Once debt exists, mechanisms emerge to manage it. Central banks stabilize markets. International organizations coordinate restructuring. Accounting standards normalize perpetual obligations. The system adapts to its own existence. This is neither good nor bad, it is structural. Debt creates relationships between borrowers and lenders, between present and future, between citizens and institutions. Those relationships shape behavior, policy, and expectation. Over time, they become difficult to disentangle. The echoes suggest that debt centrality is not accidental. It arises naturally wherever complex societies face costly collective action problems. Borrowing allows coordination across time. It distributes burdens and benefits asymmetrically. It enables actions that would otherwise be impossible. Whether future societies will maintain this arrangement remains open, but history suggests that once debt becomes structural, dislodging it requires extraordinary effort. The path of least resistance is continuation, refinancing, and gradual expansion. That has been the pattern for 4 centuries. Debt did not become central to modern economies through revolution or ideology. It became central through accumulation, small, reasonable decisions compounding over centuries. A bond issue to fund a war, a refinancing to ease fiscal pressure, a market innovation to attract investors. Each step made sense in its moment. Together, they built a system. What began as an occasional tool for managing crises evolved into permanent architecture. Governments no longer borrow only during emergencies. They borrow continuously, planning budgets around perpetual debt service. Investors no longer view sovereign bonds as risky experiments. They treat them as foundational assets. Institutions no longer debate whether debt should exist. They manage how much, at what cost, under what terms. The transformation was quiet. No proclamation announced that debt was now central. It simply became so through practice and precedent. And once it became central, reversing the trend grew difficult. Debt was load-bearing. Removing it risked collapse. This is the deeper insight. Debt's role in modern economies is not the result of error or excess. It is the result of logic, imperfect, incremental human logic. Leaders chose borrowing because it solved problems. Lenders provided capital because it generated returns. Institutions adapted because the system persisted. Whether this arrangement is sustainable depends on forces beyond history, on technology, governance, demography, and choices not yet made. But understanding how debt became central clarifies what changing it would require. Not repayment alone, but restructuring the entire edifice of expectations and institutions built around perpetual obligation. What began as necessity quietly became architecture. And architecture, once built, is hard to dismantle. If this kind of calm historical exploration interests you, there are similar patterns to examine: how currency evolved, how banking spread, how markets emerged. Each system has a quiet origin story, shaped by human decisions made long ago.